Welcome back to the Making Space podcast. As always, I'm joined by my co-hosts, Jay Kim and Sarah Joy Propay. How are you guys doing? It's great to have this conversation with you, and I know we have a super insightful guest today.
Yeah, looking forward to it. Good to see you guys.
Good to be here.
Yeah, well, today we have Reverend Dr. Matthew Niermann. His bio within itself is wow. I mean, we had to summarize. It's that impressive. I actually asked him in this conversation, how many master's degrees do you have? Because it's a number of master's degrees. He serves as the Associate Dean of College of Architecture at California Baptist University. His work is combined with his advanced graduate work in the areas of Christian theology, missiology, and philosophic apologetics. And he looks at how these inform Protestant church building aesthetics. I mean, gosh, kind of like the perfect mold for a guest for our Making Space podcast. He's also the director of strategic operation for the Lausanne movement, a global movement that mobilizes evangelical leaders towards collaboration. Sarah Joy J., did I do okay at just capturing all of that? Did I say all the words properly?
I feel exhausted. I feel exhausted just hearing it. Yeah.
I'm glad you interviewed him and not me. It's a lot to unpack there. It must have been amazing.
Oh yeah, there was. It was a thoroughly enjoyable conversation, and really, when it comes to Dr. Matthew, you're talking about somebody who has focused a lot of their vocational life literally on the nexus of what we're talking about here in this whole journey of making space, of this point of connection between our spiritual formation and our Christian faith and church facilities and buildings and the spaces that shape us. So let's jump into some of this conversation with Reverend Dr. Matthew Niermann. One of his main points, and Sarah Joy, I would just love your thoughts on this, that he made the point that beauty is a missions category. To be candid, I've never seen it that way. I've never thought of it that way. It was kind of like help me understand that perspective when he said that. But he kind of gave a whole range of thoughts around this idea of how to see beauty through a different lens. Sarah Joy, I know this fits into some of your lived experience as well.
Yeah, I love that idea, because in that idea, it's just an understanding that God communicates through beauty, that it can be just as much part of the mission. And where I've seen that really play out is I lived in Peru for a year on the coast, a coastal desert there. And the organization that I did work with, they built just these incredible churches, used a lot of local woods, spent a lot of money designing just really beautiful gardens. Gardens were not common in the desert, but they took the time and care to put in these beautiful gardens. And one of the things that they often were critiqued about, honestly, was, this is a lot of money spent on gardens and architecture when these people in these communities need some basic needs of food and medical services and all of that. Why spend the money on gardens and buildings? And they did have medical services and food services and those things as well. But what they would say is, these people have such little access to beauty, and we want to give them a taste of that beauty because it speaks so much to their human dignity, to the way they're designed, the way God created us to, again, enjoy his lavish goodness and to really understand and participate in his kindness and redemption here on earth. And so it was such an encouragement and such an inspiration to me in that time of, it really matters. The physical space matters, and that access to beauty is such an important thing that speaks volumes of who God is.
Yeah, I think anyone that's pastored understands that tension very well. Of you want to create beautiful spaces, but you open yourself to critique of should churches be doing this. And I think the framework that that the doctor gave in this conversation was helpful. I mean, I remember when the church I was pastoring, we purchased like our first pretty good quality video camera. And I never forget this. It was like $3,000. And we got complaints, like, should the church be spending money on video cameras? And I remember finding out, I mean, rugby, the sport of rugby is a big sport in Australia. We don't wear padding. We don't wear helmets. Just putting that out there. The faces do get somewhat smashed and distorted after a number of years, but nonetheless, the cameras were like $500,000 each. And the stadium was like filled with these cameras, right? And I'd never heard anybody go to the rugby and be like, oh, you know what? How dare they spend $500,000 per camera to watch, you know, men pummel each other into the ground? But a church spends $3,000 and it's like, oh my goodness, how could a church do that? Finding framework that frees pastors and boards and churches to create and build beautiful and transcendent spaces. And Jay, he talked about not so much the word transcendence, but in his vernacular, enchantment. And he talked about living in a disenchanted age, and the need to recapture enchantment within our church spaces. What's your take on that, Jay?
Yeah, I mean, I think he's tapping into the work of, you know, Charles Taylor. I think some of our listeners are pretty familiar, 20th century Canadian philosopher who talked about us living in a disenchanted age. He talks about this thing that he calls the immanent frame, and I think in short, put simply, what he meant was we just sort of live in a world where we assume that reality is only the stuff that is like right in front of us, the stuff we can see and touch and taste, and, you know, stuff that we would call normal. I think that's reality. But I love Sarah Joy, your story of a garden in Peru. You actually said like gardens are rare. And I think that's the key. You know, re-enchantment is the innate, intrinsic, I would say, universal human longing for the stuff that is rare, or the stuff that is like, you know, like unfamiliar, the stuff that in a strange way feels, Taylor talks about our memory. Like we humans have an intrinsic memory of an enchanted world. It's embedded in our DNA. So it feels familiar, but also sort of unfamiliar because our world is so disenchanted. And that's a fascinating idea to me, to just hear this conversation, because as church leaders, I think we tap into this reality a lot when it comes to, you know, the church world. For example, like with music. You know, we think about music as being this sort of transcendent experience that lifts the emotions, lifts our gaze, gives us an experience of the Spirit of God in a really powerful, whole-bodied, emotive way. But we don't think about our buildings that way as much. We think about spaces as just more functional, because spaces are like real things, you know? They're buildings you can see and touch. But is there a way that we can even think about the way our spaces are designed that re-enchants the space? Some of the study and the research that, you know, Barna and Aspen have done, we've come to discover that even like unchurched people, when they're asked about their church preferences, they're way more likely to say they're looking for church spaces that are calming rather than exhilarating, like a sanctuary rather than an auditorium, quiet than loud, more solemn than entertaining. And what's interesting to me is the stuff they prefer is the stuff that we don't get a whole lot of. Like our world is full of exhilaration, lots of big auditoriums where people play rugby or American football, which is far better than rugby, Benjamin. You know, spaces that are loud, spaces that are entertaining, you know, that's everywhere. But what people want is not that. They want the stuff that feels rare, you know, enchanted. And so I'm really fascinated to hear what he has to say about re-enchanting our spaces, because the data even shows, again, unchurched people even are really desperate and hungry for re-enchantment.
It's so true, Jay. It's a shame that all of that highly intelligent commentary was overshadowed by the dig at Australian rugby. But it's remiss of me to bring up a recent American football game that represented your home area of Northern California. We won't even talk about it. We won't talk about.
I'm just
the
neutral.
Here's something interesting. For myself and my own pastoral journey, when Dr. Matthew talked about this, I'm like, oh my goodness, there's so much in this. He sought out in his research to prove what he called the black box model of like blocking out natural light, paint the auditorium black, control that space more like a theater, high level of production. And he found the more that he researched, the more that the research pointed him in the opposite direction. And I thought that was very fascinating, because it's like you look at some of the trends, and some of these trends catch on so quickly. And like you said, Jay, some of the research that's showing that people are interested in calming versus exhilarating, or familiar, versus novel, or solemn versus entertaining. And the doctor made the point that we thought that unchurched people wanted comfortable environments. So let's remove any of the, I guess, tradition or religious aspects that we assume would present them with barriers. And the research is kind of showing, when we actually talk to unchurched and ask them, they're giving us a different collection of data to say, actually, we're not seeking comfort. We're seeking this distinguishing space and beauty. Sarah Joy, what's your instinct on that?
Oh yeah, people are looking for something other, right? And I feel like that's actually one of the strongest points of the church. What the church has to offer, it is something other. It's something different. It's rest amidst a hurried life, right? And why are we so afraid to tap into that, to run down that road? Instead, we're working as chameleons, trying to mimic the culture around us, when that's the way of Jesus calls us to be completely different.
That's a great way of wording it. Well, if you are a new listener to the Making Space podcast, can I let you know that you can learn more at barna.com/making space. And if you are a regular, I just know that this conversation with Reverend Dr. Matthew Niermann is so targeted to the very core of what the Making Space podcast series and journals are all about. You're really going to love this conversation. Reverend Dr. Matthew Niermann, I have so been looking forward to this conversation with you. Welcome to the Making Space podcast.
Thank you, Benjamin. Glad to be here.
Yeah, so great to have you with us. I couldn't help but notice you have, I don't even know how many master's degrees you have, but it's more than one, which is pretty good. You have an amazingly diverse academic background, just by means of introduction, because I think your area of specialty so marries in with the very core of what the Making Space journey has been about. How would you describe just a bit about your academic journey and how that intersects with architecture, and maybe even your love for architecture? I'm not sure, and how that connects.
The Lord has certainly carried me through a couple different paths, and at this point in my life, have brought them back together. And as you said, Benjamin, this really aligns with this Making Space initiative. I've been formally trained and also have a passion for architecture. That's one of the main reasons I'm here, I presume. I carried all the way through a PhD in architecture, but really looking at architectural design, but from a particular point of view known as empirical aesthetics. How can we broadly study wide population and understand how they understand architecture through statistics? Now, this might seem really dry or really unimportant until you begin mirroring it with my other side of passion and education. I've had the wonderful opportunity to be trained in missiology and theology. And so this empirical aesthetics, when you begin to say, what is it that the world can see or these people can believe now doesn't just dry and banal observations. This becomes an act of attempting to measure the image of God in people. If we can broadly understand the inherent nature of people and their relationship to architecture, beauty, truth, goodness, hopefully in a minor way, it's a very small way, we can get a glimpse of who God made us as humans.
Wow, that's I love that. And again, it's so central to what we're discussing here, this link between what forms us, what makes us who we are, and church design, church buildings, church facilities. I mean, our target audience is pastors and church and ministry leaders. So what's it like for you attending a church? Church buildings, personally.
Exactly.
How do you feel when you walk into a modern day church building? Or do you go to like a retro, you found some hipster cathedral that you attend?
Right.
But like in real life, how do you feel walking into a modern church building?
I bet it's somewhat akin to a baker walking into the bakery, saying, "I've had enough donuts. I've made enough in my daily work. I've made enough muffins today." But yet, walking in, no matter the diversity of the space, you still begin to feel like, "Oh, this is why I do what I do. This is what I love." I can begin to see what this is. Now, me personally, I've had a variety of architectural experiences. Having lived and breathed and worked in the evangelical church, global church for quite a while. But I do resonate with a lot of what we're talking about, a lot of your findings, a lot of my findings. Maybe I couldn't enumerate them early on, but now that I begin to see what it is, I resonate with. I am hyper aware that we live in a disenchanted age. And to finally get into a space that's enchanted in some way, that begins to call or create an encounter with God, it's tangibly different than, say, the black box.
What do you mean when you say we live in a disenchanted age?
Yeah, we live in an age where it's fundamentally closed. There is no such thing as perhaps God. There is no such thing as the spiritual world. Only what we can touch, taste, feel, right? Is this effect of the Enlightenment, the effect of where we are today. In a technological age, that there is nothing enchanted here, right? It's just what we see and what we have. And to be in an enchanted space, Benjamin, is to begin to sense and feel that longing for a far off place beyond what we have here, beyond what we can see and touch. And that stoking of that longing begins to call me to God.
Well, I appreciate the baker analogy. Having myself recently been through a pastoral transition a couple of years back after pastoring for 20 years, I likened it to moving cities and just attending a church versus pastoring a church. It was kind of like the dentist being in the dentist chair for the first time. And you're like, oh, this feels different to what I thought.
Yeah.
And that's been an interesting mixed bag of emotions to kind of process and wade through. I was recently in an old historic Baptist church in Manhattan. And it was like the first time in a long time where I was like, just being in this place, I feel a connection somehow to God. Does the baker still feel that going into environments, or what environments do you feel that in?
Yeah, the baker still feels the love for muffins when he walks into those spaces. I greatly appreciate, and I want to say this up front, I greatly appreciate the technical skills we've developed in the evangelical church with music, lights, production. We do that better than anybody I've seen to a great effect. But that's using only half of our toolbox, right? We can also begin to utilize the space inherently to create this connection. So when I can go into those spaces that has high ceilings, that has natural light, that has connection to outside, so God's general revelation can speak alongside the special revelation of the preacher, when I can see and actually hear the community around me professing who God is, these are all things that make God much more plausible and attractive, if you will, in those moments.
So let me press into that a little bit and follow my natural curiosity. And we're going to cover a range of areas in this conversation. But take my homeland, Australia. I'm not sure if you've ever been. But it certainly became a trend, I don't know, 10 years ago, that auditoriums are painted black. There is no natural light. I kind of did that myself to a degree. So that became kind of the cultural norm. It's pretty amazing how quickly that also became just standard. What did we lose in doing that?
Yeah. I can say that we gained the ability to craft and shape dramatics, craft and shape emotions.
Yes.
This stands in a long tradition of evangelicalism that works with these dramatics and emotions to create an encounter of God. But what we lost, Benjamin, is we lost the continuation of that when the lights go out, the continuation of that when the music turns off. We lost the ability to have that connection with God in the quiet, in the silence. And we lost the ability to distinguish that experience from the everyday scrolling through my phone, which is also media driven, which is also lights driven, which is also drama driven. We've lost the stillness of God in that. And in that, we've lost the fullness, I think, of that experience with God.
Well, that's a wonderful answer. And wow, I think there's a lot in that. What would you say the role of a church building is? What is its primary function?
Certainly. I think any great architect, right? I'll put on my architecture hat here, will say the building must enhance, must allow for, and must augment ministry, right? And that's essentially what it's being built for. If your space does not allow you to do what you want to do and need to do well, it's no longer a good space. But hopefully we talk as we move along, Benjamin, it's more than just utility. We can often think about multi-purpose space and utility and getting it to work, and that's square one. And there's a lot to unpack here, but maybe let me look at one particular idea. We recognize that a church building in and of itself is a public statement, right? It's not just the utility. Unlike maybe a painting, let's say, which hangs on somebody's wall privately, the architecture stands in the community and says, this is what we are and here's who we are. And there's a lot of ramifications to that, the publicness of a church building, that we need to understand that role a little bit more. I'll stop there, but there's a lot more we can unpack there, Benjamin.
So what kind of public statement are we wanting to make? I mean, if I'm a pastor listening to this and the architecture makes some form of, like, what do we need to keep in mind in that messaging that we are expressing to the public?
What I want to maybe bring to this table uniquely from my work here, Benjamin, is an understanding of a perceptive relationship that happens here. Now, there's a lot of theological understanding of what we should be doing theologically, and I'm sure there'll be other guests who might speak to that. But for our short time here, let me bring this notion of perception that's there. So when you begin to see a church building, and when I say church building, something that looks like a church building or is identifiable like a church building, that does something. This is what I call generational witness here. So when we see, there's a couple notions here. When we see the signs and symbols of something around us, it becomes a lot more plausible that thing is actually true. For example, I grew up in the small Midwest town. A village didn't have a stoplight until I graduated from high school. But there were 13, 14 churches around town, so it seemed just very plausible that Christianity was true. Now, there were no mosques or temples around, so Hinduism or Buddhism or Islam just did not even seem plausible, to take a direct one-to-one comparison here. So when we have these identifiable signs and symbols around us, the plausibility of the faith increases. So I have pastors who come to me and say, we have an amazing church that's meeting under a tree. I say, God bless you. Keep meeting under that tree, brother. Say, preach how you can, but not everybody should be meeting under a tree. Because if we begin to all meet under a tree and don't have identifiable any church buildings, then the plausibility of the gospel begins to decrease rapidly within our society.
Wow, that's a really fascinating thought and a broad, very broad perspective. The Barna Group asked respondents to rate their agreement with the following statements. Churches should reflect the beauty of God. which is interesting. The majority of the respondents agree with that statement. And this includes unchurched people. 30% agree strongly, and another 47% agree somewhat. So if we know that beauty is something it's more than a pleasantry, it's a theological mandate for design, how can we think about beauty as a value for pastors and church leaders?
This is where I want to have one of my main suggestions for pastors out there. Often we think about beauty as a theological necessity or theological aesthetics or something in seminary that we didn't really study and don't quite get to because I need to store my chairs, right? I need to be able to have this ministry going. And I need to reach people, right? And I need to get into the community and have our presence. But I want to say that each one of those pastors who have thought that thought or found that challenge of, we need to be economical, we need to not be hypocritical, we need to be about ministry. I want to challenge them that the beauty is not only a theological category, Benjamin, but in all your studies and all my studies and other studies who have looked at this as well, beauty fundamentally is a missions category. So when we begin thinking about outreach, we begin thinking about spreading the gospel message, beauty must be central. You pointed to some of your stats there to showcase that. Some of the stats in my particular work show that beauty is the primary driver of unchurched people preferring, judging, perceiving, and feeling comfortable in a church. We have this long-standing narrative in the broader Protestant evangelical church that says church must be comfortable, right? It must be welcoming for somebody. The challenge is we never really asked unchurched people that, right? I've talked with hundreds and thousands of unchurched people and church people, and churched have this narrative. We unchurched want it comfortable. But when you sit down and actually talk with unchurched, that's not the narrative at all, Benjamin. The narrative is, I long for a place to be beautiful. I need that beauty in my life. I want to go to that beautiful church. What church do I prefer? Clearly the beautiful one. Or even lament. Sometimes you hear, well, I ended up going to church for the first time and I did not want to go to a Walmart. I wanted to go to a beautiful church, but I just ended up at the Walmart. And I'm kind of sad about it. Right? So as we begin to think about this, if we begin to want to draw individuals into our churches, beauty has to be a primary missions category.
Very insightful. Maybe we should ask people those questions. Maybe if they want comfort, they would just stay in bed. Or stay on the couch. I mean, it's just a great thought, the search for beauty from unchurched people and maybe that gap between what we think within the church world unchurched people are looking for, and when we do the research and ask them, or maybe just do the courtesy to ask them, we discover, there's some other things that they're searching for, and maybe they're not finding places and spaces of beauty in many other arenas of life, and there's a search for that. I think that is just, for pastors to categorize beauty in a missions category. I mean, what led to that thought? It's very insightful. What led to that language for you?
It was hundreds and hundreds of hours of research and pulling out the understanding that this is what it is. I mean, if we begin to think about our broader culture, we live in a visual age, right? I think that's pretty natural for people to observe. But the church loves to lead with truth, right? Let me hit you with truth. Let me teach you the truth. Let me preach you the truth. But in a visual age, beauty often needs and should come first, right? The longing, the beauty, the attractiveness, and then the longing for truth, working from beauty, then to goodness, then to truth, often is a much more effective path in a contextualized Western world today.
I think that narrative, I'm hearing more and more, the importance of beauty, not just necessarily being a physical structure, but just in that broader category, and the story that it tells. In a recent interview with Barna, you talked more about this, that unchurched have an interest and a quiet longing for worship in their lives, this need for a sacred space, even if they're not attending church regularly. And in the Making Space study, and these journals are available to listeners. But I asked unchurched people about their church preferences. They're more likely to say they'd rather it be more calming than exhilarating, more familiar than novel, more sanctuary than auditorium, more quiet than loud, more solemn than... I'm reading these and I'm like, that's kind of like the opposite of how I've been raised and the stream of church I've been in. Help people like me, Doctor, who have I have not thought, oh, I need to be more calming than exhilarating, or it needs to be more solemn than entertaining, or more quiet than loud. How can we think differently about this?
Yeah, I actually went into all my studies from the same tradition, presumably as you, Benjamin, trying to show that the black box is where it needs to be, right? Trying to show that these are the right things to do. And it took a lot of humility to finally, after years, say, wait a minute. The narratives we have in the church just don't play out when you talk with the unchurched. We begin to need to think about the longing for the church. Let me return to the idea of the disenchanted age. Charles Taylor, this sociologist, has great thinking on how we got to a disenchanted age. But he begins to ask the question, 500 years ago, why was it almost impossible not to believe in God, but now almost impossible to believe in God? And he makes this understanding that we still have this longing for transcendence in all of us, but yet we live in a world that has no plausibility that exists. So he makes this basic observation that unbelief or unbelievers are still haunted by the transcendence, while believers believe while doubting. And the answer to that is this need and taste for the transcendence, even if I'm not worshiping there, to know that transcendence exists is so core of who I am as an unchurched person, haunted by that transcendence, that it becomes an important part not only of their understanding of the world, even just to see it, but also understanding of the broader community.
So when you say you went searching to kind of prove a model of the black box, describe what you mean by the black box.
Yeah. So the black box church saying, hey, let's have no windows in our church. Let's aim for comfort and welcome within our congregation, within our architectural approach. Let's aim for emotive development within our church services as the primary encounter of God. Let's see what we can do to attend to the unchurched through relevance, through comfort, welcoming, low barriers, no barriers to the gospel, no barriers to somebody walking into the church, right? The famed 1990s model here. Like, let's make church look like an IBM. You go to work and you go to church and it feels exactly the same. There are no barriers to somebody coming into the church building. And I went into this saying, yes, as a Christian architect and as a missiologist, I want to have no barriers to the gospel for people. So how can we even do this better was the question I started. And Benjamin, the answer I got, and how do we do this better, is by having some barriers, is by having a space that's different than their regular life, is by creating a space that is not IBM headquarters, but is more a sacred space.
So in some degree, it's a little counterintuitive, right?
Very much so.
To what our instinctive starting point would be. And if I'm hearing you correctly, the church building is just one expression of what you just talked about.
And it's what we're talking about as an architect, but this is a broader conversation, I believe. Yeah.
Culture. But the building is an expression of that culture. And it's kind of the physical representation and symbolism of what that culture and set of beliefs is and what that approach is.
And Benjamin, I was really shocked by how many of the narratives or assumptions we just got wrong. Right, we have one of these narratives in our church building that we don't want to build expensive or ostentatious. We want to be seen as ministry focused, community focused, and not be hypocritical. Why would you spend money on yourself, on your building, if you're trying to serve the poor? But when you go out and you begin to talk with people, that narrative does not stand up at all. You can think of it as like a mayor who's going to build a new library for the town. And when he builds the library, he builds it completely cheap, maybe a trailer, maybe a black box, or just a white warehouse, and say, here, town, I have a gift for you. I'm here to serve and love you. The perception of that is not that. The perception of that would be the mayor, you don't love this town. You don't love this community. Why are you building this for here? Again, this notion of architecture is a public thing. And when you ask the unchurched, the same thing happens. They say those who build without beauty and those who build without contributing to the community are hypocritical. Exact opposite of our narrative. Because they begin to say, why are you saving all the money for yourself to do what you want for your ministry and giving nothing back to our community? So again, we have a lot of these narratives, Benjamin, that just never played out when you began asking and looking at the statistics.
It's a great analogy. So, say I'm a local church pastor or church leader listening to this, and I'm stirred by the narrative of beauty, the enchanted space. What is, like, are there any areas that you would say, hey, you may not have a $5 million budget to do this, but here are at least some conversations that you could start within your context, or some things that you could start to think about practically?
Yeah, certainly. And I want to assure everybody that the discussion of beauty or transcendent space does not mean cathedral. Right? It does not mean Notre Dame or Saint Denis or any of these. Right? It means it's going to happen in a very small space. We could begin to look at how do we find natural elements back into it. Right? Another valuation Barna has found as well. How do we begin to take the shades off our windows, right? Have some natural light in there, begin to incorporate general revelation or God's earth into our spaces? How do we begin to find a few materials that don't cost a lot, right? That can be applied with some craft, more than just painted CMU. And how do we take our front facade and how do we create some verticality with it, or other kind of architectural methods? And there's wonderful architects around the nation who could do great things with little budget. But it's a matter of creating some of those spaces, and maybe counterintuitively, again, Benjamin, a few songs, turn down the volume, right? So that people can hear each other profess at the same time, or hear that quiet. There's a lot of tactics here. And tactics we just have to recover, which we've been doing for 1,500 years. Just in the last 50, we haven't. So they're readily available. We just have to recover them again.
We have to rediscover some of our rich history as followers of Jesus in the modern church. And I know that I speak on behalf of many people. We appreciate you helping us do that. What closing words of encouragement would you offer for leaders listening today? I know I've personally got so much out of this conversation, and people can read your books, articles, and so forth. I know we could talk for a lot more about this subject. But what closing thoughts of encouragement would you have today for leaders?
Yeah, let me repeat that key phrase, the one takeaway phrase I want pastors to think about leaving this. Beauty is a missions category. And maybe that seems daunting, but just to our point here, Benjamin, in the last few minutes, this is something that the church has become experts in over 1,500, 2,000 years. This is nothing that we have to reinvent. We just have to rediscover who we are and our skill sets in this particular area. So as a group, as a church, we can simply look back, we can remember, and we can take these tactics in a modern way and actually attend to reaching people through beauty.
Beauty is a missions category.
Yes.
Rediscovering the enchanted space. You've heard it here with the Reverend Dr. Matthew Niermann. Oh my goodness, thank you so much. I know we've just got like the tip of the iceberg of a lifetime of study, research, vocation in this area. We're so grateful to you. Thank you for your time with us today,
Benjamin.
Doctor.
Much appreciated.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Making Space podcast. We're so glad that you got to enjoy this conversation with the Reverend Dr. Matthew Niermann. And if you've been encouraged, learned something new today, please leave a review. It really helps us. Leave a rating or share this with a friend, and we'll catch you next time on the Making Space podcast.